Autofocus 1.33 times anamorphic lens. This is the 40mm T1.8 by Sirui. Now, this is the first of the kind. It is for APS-C, but I have been using it on my full frame camera, and sure, when it arrived, I put it on my A7 IV and thought it was for full frame because it did the whole coverage of the sensor. A little bit of vignetting, but I literally read an email the other day and I was like, wait, S35? How did I get that wrong? But fantastic. Let's talk about this lens. So this Sirui 40mm T1.8 is a 1.33 times anamorphic lens. It covers Super 35 or APS-C side sensors. It has maximum aperture of a T1.8 to a T22. It has an autofocus to manual focus switch, a custom button, a clickable or declickable aperture ring, and both the focus and aperture ring have gear rings. It has a minimum focusing distance of 0.6 meters, it has a 360-degree focus throw, a 77mm front filter thread, it has 11 aperture blade diaphragm, a USB-C port on the bottom for firmware updates. It comes in blue or neutral flare, and it also comes in an E, X, Z, or micro four thirds mounts, and it weighs a total of 614 grams. You can get this for the early bird price of $699, or it's $799 after the sale. Now, I do have to stress what the 1.33 times anamorphic lens does on a 16:9 sensor. Extremely advantageous compared to a 1.6 times squeeze or a 2 times anamorphic squeeze, because you are going to actually fit this directly on a CinemaScope timeline absolutely perfect compared to utilizing this. You're going to be cutting so much off the sides because with these kind of lenses, you almost need a 4x3 or a 3x2 size sensor to really capitalize on the full width of these lenses. So let's take this basic Sony sensor that's out of, let's say, the FX3 or FX6. It's a 35.6mm by 23.8mm 3x2 size sensor. Now, you're only really able to film in 16:9 or 17:9 with these Sony cameras, but let's break it down with 16:9. So if you use a 1.6 times anamorphic squeeze, you actually get a 2.84 to 1 ratio. And let's say your output is the standard traditional CinemaScope of 2.35 to 1. You're still going to have extra bits on the side that you'll have to cut off in the end. Now, if you utilize a 1.8 times squeeze anamorphic lens, you end up with a 3.2 to 1 ratio, which is even wider. So when you put it onto the CinemaScope timeline, you're still going to have to chop off more of the sides. And the same thing with a 2 times anamorphic squeeze, you actually end up with a 3.55 to 1 ratio, which once again, you have more on the sides that you need to trim. Now, if you utilize the new Sirui 40mm 1.33 times anamorphic squeeze on a 16:9 sensor, you end up with a 2.36 to 1 ratio, which is pretty much the standard 2.35 to 1 CinemaScope ratio. So you wouldn't even really need to chop any of the sides, which gives you more total resolution overall. Now, to make matters even more difficult, what if you actually have just your standard 16:9 timeline, which is what you see generally in YouTube? Well, things are actually going to be a lot more worse because you have to cut far more off the left and right hand side. And this is where you're probably going to need a higher resolution camera like a 6K or 8K or even a 12K sensor. And this is what's going to give you that extra resolution to play with so you can afford to cut off the sides. But if you have a regular 4K sensor that's in the FX3, cutting off the sides could actually be quite detrimental to your footage. And it can actually make it look far too soft. But I mean, if you want that really soft look, then that's great. But if you don't want that soft look, then this is what you have to actually consider. So this is actually a massive pro to a 1.33 times anamorphic lens on a 16:9 or 17:9 sensor. But this is where things get interesting because if you're able to film in open gate 3x2 like you can with the Lumix S5 2X, this is what gives you more height with the same width. So when you squeeze a 1.6 into a CinemaScope timeline, you're actually chopping off less off the sides, which makes 3x2 sensors or 4x3 sensors far more usable than 16x9 or 17x9 sensors. Now, I think one of the most interesting things when it comes to this anamorphic lens, and they haven't done with any of these other lenses, is the bokeh shape. Now, it's very interesting. It's almost hexagonal now, and you can see the actual hexagon, I suppose, framing inside the actual lens barrel itself. Now, it does have 11 aperture blades, so it's going to be nice and smooth whatever shape it's projecting, and it tends to project that hexagon shape at wide open at T1.8. But if you do stop it down to around about T2.8, this is where it starts to get a little bit more oval shaped as opposed to that hexagon shape. And this is just an interesting move. It's a bold move. No one's really done this before with these kind of new lenses. And I think this is one of those things where you're either going to love it or hate it. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you like this sort of style of bokeh? It's pretty interesting and I honestly like it. Now, in saying that as well, this is a 40mm lens. Now, I am using it on full frame cameras. If you do put it on APS-C or Super 35, times that 40 by 1.5, and that will give you that crop and the full frame focal length equivalent. And I definitely can't wait till they release, like a 75 or an 85mm lens, because that is going to get you some really interesting looking bokeh. So I might have to put it down a little bit. But this is the 50mm f1.8, the original anamorphic lens by Sirui. This is their first full frame lens they actually brought out in the Super 35 range. And that seems like a very, very long time ago, but it's the same framing. Now, obviously you can see the vignettings on the sides because I still do have it in full frame mode on the A7 IV. And I guess the image circle just isn't as large as the newer autofocus lens. But let's throw on the 50mm T2.9 full frame anamorphic lens. So this is the 50mm T2.9 full frame 1.6 times anamorphics. It's a manual focus lens, just like your Super 35 version. And obviously I might not be tack sharp, so I will have to use the follow focus system and monitor that. Whereas obviously, autofocus lens takes care of all the autofocus and keeps everything sharp. But that is a T-stop. This is also a T-stop. So if you don't know what a T-stop is, essentially like if it's an f1.8, that means it's an f1.8 when it comes to the front of the lens, but when it hits the back of the lens, there may actually be light that diffracts around and you may actually lose a little bit of light. So it could be a T1.9 or a T2 by the time it hits the actual sensor. So the T-stop's essentially your transmitted value. So if you have an T1.8 lens like this one, and then you swap to another T1.8 lens, it's going to have the same transmitted value, or it's meant to have the same transmitted value. It's great for cinematographers. If you keep switching lenses, you know exactly what kind of light is going into the sensor. Then you can adjust your lights, to suit that scene. But you can see the differences between the bokeh of this lens and obviously the bokeh of your Super 35 original lens and the new 40mm T1.8 lens. It's pretty interesting. So because it is a video-based lens, sharpness isn't really an important thing, but let's check out the sharpness chart on this thing anyway. So this is at full frame coverage at T1.8. It's pretty tack sharp in the center and it does start to soften out into the corners. We'll talk about distortion in a second. At T2 and at T2.8, it's very similar. It does obviously get a little bit sharper. And then at T4, T5, 6, it does start to get really sharp in the center and out to the corners, and T8 obviously reached its peak sharpness. And then when it comes to distortion, it's pretty interesting because there's barrel distortion at the top and bottom, but it's pin cushioning on the left and right hand side, which is very strange, very unique. I haven't really seen this before. But don't forget, this is a Super 35 lens. So if you do actually go into the Super 35 crop, this is where the lens is actually optimized to. So it is a little bit more sharper in the center and the edges, and then it's just barrel distortion at the top and bottom, and you can't notice that pin cushioning on the sides because it crops in enough where the elements are optimized for this Super 35 coverage. And when it comes to chromatic aberrations and high contrasting edges, I didn't really see any, but if you do end up pixel peeping, this is where you probably could see just a little bit. It's pretty well controlled in my opinion. So let's check out the flares on this lens. Now the flaring is pretty interesting. I actually really like the look of this flaring. It's not overly blue. There seems to be a little bit of teal elements and it does break up a little bit. It actually looks quite characterized. It's pretty pleasing to my eye, but this is completely subjective anyway. Now, like most anamorphic lenses, you will experience focus breathing, and there does seem to be a little bit of focus breathing in this lens, but not crazily massive, but pretty standard for anamorphic lenses. Now, obviously, because it is an autofocus lens, especially the first of its kind, we do need to see how this actually performs in the real world. And, you know, so far so good. It's just a fantastic all-round autofocus lens. And I really wasn't expecting it to be, you know, amazing because it's anamorphic and because obviously it's third party, but Sirui are doing some incredible things when it comes to autofocus, specifically like this new Aurora full frame range. Their autofocus has been pretty phenomenal in this thing, and this one is pretty much second to none as well. And this is pretty much how close you can get to faces with full frame coverage at the minimum focusing distance of 0.6 meters. And obviously it'll look more cropped in when it's in Super 35 mode that this lens is actually designed for. Now, because these original Sirui anamorphic lenses are manual focus lenses, they do have a manual focus ring. Now, this one obviously has a manual focus ring, but it's focused by wire, so it's not directly attached to any sort of hard stops. And look, there is no real way for me to actually test this, but it's more personal experience, and it actually feels quite comfortable to pull manual focus. It's perfectly fine, even though it is focused by wire, but it seems pretty responsive and fairly linear as well. Now, similarly with the Aperture, it is controlled by wire, but there is that hard stop all the way up to auto or all the way to the T1.8. But anything in between, you can choose whether you want it declicked or clicked. It's up to you, but you don't actually see the Aperture move when the camera is completely off because it is by wire. So look, overall, I do like this lens. It's pretty interesting. The autofocus is nice and snappy. It does give you a little bit of character. Not sure on the bokeh shape, it really is subjective there. The build quality is nice. It almost covers the full frame sensor, which is pretty nice, but it's an APS-C or Super 35 lens. It seems to be relatively sharp, and it has some decent barrel distortion in the Super 35 mode. So look, I think it's a brilliant step in the right direction for Sirui when it comes to autofocus anamorphics, and hopefully we may actually see full frame versions of these in the future. Thanks for watching, guys. I will put a link in the description below so you guys can check it out, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.